All right, everybody, thanks for coming. The first and most important question of the night, raise your hand if you have read The Jungle. Keep your hand up if you remember most of what you read from The Jungle. Yeah, a few hands went down. Now, raise your hand if you have not read it, but you generally kind of know what it's about. And raise your hand if you have no idea about anything about this book. All right, awesome, I love that. The whole, as wide a spectrum as we could possibly have. I think we have some people who wrote like long papers on this book in high school. So, without further ado, seeing the jungle for the trees, or aiming for the heart, hitting the stomach, how America missed the point of Upton Sinclair's muckraking masterpiece. The Jungle it was released serially in 1905 over the course of pretty much the entire year. I believe the first chapter came out in February, and the last chapter came out in November of 1905, and then it was republished by Doubleday Page, the publishing company, as well. I'll get into the publishing history later, but it was republished as its own novel, heavily edited in 1906. A original manuscript of the novel from the newspaper it was in was found many decades after the book was originally published, and it is very generally considered that the edited version is much, much better. So if you're worried about which version you need to read, you don't need to be that worried. I'm not going to spend too much time on the plot of the book, but just so everybody understands, The Jungle was written to kind of expose the meatpacking companies in Chicago, specifically expose how they treated their workers and the general kind of moral degradation of the beef trust, which I will get into what exactly that means. It was the plot, in a sentence, is a Lithuanian immigrant named Jurgis Rudkis. He's a peasant in Lithuania. He comes over to the United States with his family. They have one kind of, I think by our standards, kind of tenuous connection. It's like a cousin of an in-law who got rich in Chicago. Spoiler alert, he did not get rich in Chicago. He owned a deli, and he was heavily in debt. But they come over to Chicago, and he begins working in the Union Stockyards. And over the course of the first 2/3 of the novel, it essentially destroys his entire life. And it's an incredibly well-written book. It is 200 pages of seemingly bottomless human misery. It's a really tough read. And that's why I'm not going to get in too much of the plot. But terrible things happen to everybody in his family. He sees the most disgusting things in the stockyards. And then, essentially, the last 100 pages of the book, he joins a union and becomes a socialist. And then Upton Sinclair kind of leaves us with that, as if that's like the end. That's like problem solved. He's a socialist now, which makes you could probably guess what his political position was. Now, in this talk, I'm going to talk about the four major things here. First, obviously, is the history. What is the book accurate? What is the historical context that the book was written in? And then the labor themes, which was his original goal with the book and what he wanted to have the biggest effect on. And then the meat sanitation, which is what he had the actual biggest effect on. And then finally, the thing that kind of hangs over the whole book, and I think in 2026, you cannot read this book without thinking about this at every page, is immigration. So, the history. This is a bird's eye view of the Union Stockyards in the early 1900s. This is more or less what it would have looked like when Jurgis Rudkis worked there. It's what it would have looked like when Upton Sinclair was doing his research on the stockyards. Pardon me. Now, one of the most important things to understand about what I call the bottomless human misery of the book is that there's no single event that happens to these characters that is implausible or unlikely or just didn't happen. But what is implausible is for all of these terrible things to happen to one family in like 2 years. If you guys have ever seen The Bear, it's like, it's kind of a mildly realistic depiction of what it's like to work in a restaurant, but you don't have all of those things happening to one restaurant over the course of 3 months. And the sanitation conditions, also very largely accurate. Both the inspectors at the time that were spurred on by this book and historians after the fact have found that the sanitation, anything that can be confirmed, is very plausible. The only thing that can't be explicitly confirmed is whether anybody fell into a meat processing vat and then was shipped out with the rest of the meat. So there's no real way to confirm that. But if you haven't read the book, that's an example of the kinds of things that are depicted in the book. The major thing that he gets wrong, this is very important, is the community that existed in the Back of the Yards neighborhood. The immigrants who moved into the Back of the Yards built very, very strong communities through their churches and through their kind of shared culture and shared community spaces. The saloons. Upton Sinclair was a lifelong teetotaler. His father was an alcoholic, and so he had a lifelong kind of aversion to alcohol and also had a very, very dim view of alcohol morally and people who were involved with it. So despite all of the services that saloons would provide, they would cash checks for you, they would serve as a bank, they would hold your money for you, which when you don't speak English and you go to a bank and nobody wants to loan you any money or hold your money for you, that's an invaluable service. So saloons were very, very important to the strength of the communities that were built. When he arrived in Chicago, he was immediately plugged into the local union organizing networks. He was commissioned to write the book by a socialist newspaper called Appeal to Reason. It was the biggest socialist newspaper in the country at the time, and at this time in American history, that's the time to be the biggest socialist newspaper. I believe in the I can't remember if it's 04 or 06 presidential election, Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate, received 600,000 votes, which was unheard of. Now, like I said, late 1904, Upton Sinclair arrives, and he literally announces himself at the hotel. He says, "Hello, I'm Upton Sinclair, and I want to write the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Labor Movement." If you've never heard of that book, it was very similar. It was sort of or if you've never read it, it was like, a novel about slavery that showed a lot of people in the North who had no close contact with slavery how brutal it really was, and how not just functionally bad, but the moral depravity of slavery as an institution. Now, Upton Sinclair his family was sort of a impoverished Southern aristocratic family. I could not find evidence on whether any of his ancestors owned slaves, but I would be surprised if none of them did. He had ancestors who were naval officers in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the quasi-war with France, all of the major naval conflicts. And so he was born in Baltimore, moved to New York City, and became a socialist kind of all at once in his early 20s. And most of his peers were what I believe is a modern term, champagne socialists. They were like wealthy college professors and business owners who were business owners but also were kind of socialists. And so his attitude is reflected a little bit here, where he says, reflecting on the book The Jungle, he says, "I might have succeeded if I had had as good an opportunity as Mrs. Stowe had," the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, "but my task was so much harder." And the task he's referring to is showing people how bad things are and convincing people that this is a situation that needs to be remedied. Now, I think it does tell you a little bit about his attitudes towards race, that he thought, well, yeah, slavery was bad, but you see what I'm dealing with here? So, and I'll talk much more about his attitudes towards race. He was his racism was pretty bog standard for the time. He was undeniably racist. He had a lot of the ways that black characters are portrayed in his book is shocking at times. So, over the course of 1905, he publishes The Jungle in Appeal to Reason, and then in 1906, they release it as a unified novel with Doubleday Page. Now, this letter, Dear President Roosevelt, I am trying again to get Mr. Sinclair to cut out what you so truly call ridiculous socialistic rant at the end of his book. Now, it is kind of fairly characterized that way. It's very kind of shoehorned in. It was, from a literary perspective, it was criticized at the time, and it is still often criticized now. It's very much, like I said at the beginning, he kind of becomes a socialist and then listens to kind of educated and wealthy socialists, much like Upton Sinclair, talk about how awesome socialism is. And this really irritated Teddy Roosevelt. So he wrote to the publisher and said, you guys got to get this socialist stuff out of this book. So he had already cut 30,000 words from the book, and he would not budge. But and I also wanted to see if Frank Nelson Doubleday, if he would just kind of lie to the president, and he'd say, "Oh, sorry, Mr. President, I'm trying, but he won't budge." And then he's laughing with Upton Sinclair, like, "Can you believe this guy wants you to change your book?" Frank Nelson Doubleday ended up writing a memoir, a commissioned memoir of, I think, one of the members of the Armour family, who were the biggest meatpacking company. So he probably did try to get the book to become less socialist. And then in 1906, in mid-1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act are passed. And this is from the New York Times when it passes the Senate. This is before it passes Congress completely, but it was a huge surprise. And like the paper says, its passage is the direct consequence of the disclosures made in the novel. Now, this is the back of the yards neighborhood today, up in the top right next to the Stevenson? Yeah, Stevenson. Man, that's embarrassing. You can see Sox Park. I don't want to lose audio on the camera, but I'm going to get up and point at it real quick just so everyone. So if anybody's not from Chicago and they don't know back of the yards, that in the top left, that is the south branch of the Chicago River. And like I said, the Stevenson going down. And then on the other side of on the right side of the Stevenson, that is Bronzeville. Dan Ryan. You let me say it so many times. Yeah, the Stevenson. That's what I meant. Oh, man. I can feel myself getting red now.
Welcome to Chicago.
So, the stockyards at the time, I know, right? Very professional. This is overlaid directly. So the main difference really is you'll see at the top of the image, see if does the mouse pop up there? Yeah. So up here, this stretch right here is Bubbly Creek. And Bubbly Creek once fed in, you can see it's cut out right here. It was filled in, but this was the slip for, a lot of the industrial waterways down here by back of the yards. And if you've ever heard stories about how the Chicago River was so polluted you could walk across the surface of it, or rats would run across the surface, that may have been true of parts of the river at all times throughout history, but for the most part, that story about the river comes from Bubbly Creek. Bubbly Creek is where the stockyards would dump all of the animal waste, and the animals would decompose at the bottom, and then the gases would bubble up, and unwitting tourists would try to walk across the river and fall right in. Some people would skim the lard off the top of Bubbly Creek and sell it. And then when the stockyards realized how much money there was to be made in that, they got an injunction to stop that person so that they could do it themselves. So, and then the grayed out boxes on the left, those are all city dumps. And all of those dumps were owned by a local politician. This is mentioned a lot in the actual book. And one of the big ways that children could contribute to the family at this time is when their parents were at work. They would go to the dump and just kind of dig through and look for valuables or look for anything useful. It was a little dangerous for children. So one of the biggest reasons that the stockyards ended up being in Chicago is because Chicago is the centerpiece of the American freight rail system. And it then also the passenger rail system, that kind of went away, but it's still the centerpiece of the American freight rail. 55% of all cattle that were slaughtered in the United States were slaughtered in the Union stockyards. And the beef trust was, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, excuse me. So the market concentration, the cattle sellers in the outer states, in Kansas, in Iowa, in Oklahoma, because of the market concentration in the beef trust, they would get lower prices for their cattle. The beef trust would coordinate the purchase price of meat, and they would coordinate selling meat, and they would coordinate the wages that they would pay people. And then one thing I don't want to miss here is another one of the jobs. Jurgis in the book floats around between a few different jobs. And if anybody was here, not to give myself a shout out, but if anybody was here at my talk last year, Jurgis worked in the tunnels that, if anybody remembers the flood in 1990, Jurgis helps dig those tunnels. And I have my lecture from last year is on YouTube if you guys want to check it out. And thank you. Upton Sinclair gives an overview of the digging of the Chicago tunnels, the freight tunnel system, and it's entirely accurate. The city council had passed a quiet and innocent little bill allowing a company to construct telephone conduits under the city streets. And upon the strength of this, a great corporation had proceeded to tunnel all Chicago with a system of railway freight subways. In the city, there was a combination of employers representing hundreds of millions of capital and formed for the purpose of crushing the labor unions, referring specifically to the Teamsters who drove the wagons on the surface. If you have tunnels with narrow gauge rail under the ground, you don't have to hire any Teamsters. The aldermen declared that they had had no idea of it all, in spite of the fact that the main entrance to the work had been in the rear of the saloon of one of them. It's a miracle. That group of aldermen that was responsible for the construction of the tunnels, and also the aldermen that represented back of the yards at this time, was known as the Gray Wolves because they had gray hair and they were ruthlessly corrupt. And in the book, the character Mike Scully it's a stand-in name for one of the Gray Wolves at the time. Excuse me. And then finally, the word trust. I'm sure everybody's heard the term antitrust law. At this time in corporate law in American history, it was very normal to kind of get a bunch of competitors together and sell each other shares in each other's companies and form literally a trust and coordinate formally and without any reservations whatsoever. And that's why trust busting and antitrust law became a big deal. Now we call it monopolies. It's a little bit less straightforward because of the antitrust laws that were passed since then. The year before The Jungle came out, there was a decision against the giant beef trust, and it was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who's a very significant Supreme Court justice. Now, the muckrakers were Muckraker is a term that comes from a Teddy Roosevelt speech. It literally refers to a character in a story that was written in 1678 as a kind of Protestant devotional story. And one of the characters is literally a muckraker referring to animal poop. And his job was to clear out the animal pens. And as a muckraker, he never looks up from work. He only looks down at the muck and would not regard the crown he was offered. I'm very curious what kind of crowns Teddy Roosevelt thought was being offered to people in real life. But this speech was given as a result of the irritation that Upton Sinclair caused to Teddy Roosevelt. And even though Teddy Roosevelt, as a popular and progressive president, was, what's the word I'm looking for? Had an established relationship with other muckraker authors, I believe, 17th Amendment, which made senators elected directly by the states, was passed because of a muckraker news article. And after this speech, the muckrakers kind of never recovered. But he was very much focusing directly on Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was 27 years old when he wrote The Jungle. He had been kind of struggling to achieve literary success. His first relative success was it was a memoir of Arthur, I can't remember the last name, but he essentially published an obituary of an author who committed suicide that did not exist and never existed. He drummed up this like fake interest in this author's book, published this fake obituary, and then published a book under the dead fake author's name. And that's how he kind of got his first, couple of bucks. Still not a lot of success. He wrote the first in a trilogy of books about the Civil War. The book he wrote was called Manassas, which also tells you a little bit about his sympathies. He was anti-slavery, but the way that he criticized it was very strange. And I would say the things that were bad about slavery were a little bit different than the things that he thinks were bad about slavery. It was called Manassas, the Southern name for the first Battle of Bull Run, because Southerners refer to Civil War battles as by their nearest water feature, like a river, and Northerners refer to it by the nearest railroad. So that's why a lot of us would know it as First Bull Run, but he knew it as Manassas. And that's what he titled his book. And he realized very quickly that nobody really wanted to read his trilogy of Civil War books, and he never wrote the next two. Because he ended up publishing a story in Appeal to Reason about socialism, and the editors of Appeal to Reason liked it so much they commissioned him to write a novel about socialism, and that became The Jungle. Now, one of I think the big reasons that The Jungle kind of missed its mark on what it was trying to achieve is it was just another shot in a constant back and forth of socialist and labor and capitalist kind of struggle in America. People were already talking about socialism a lot. People were talking about labor and unions a lot. So for somebody to write a book about how great labor unions are, even if it was the best one anyone had written, it was just another book about socialism. And the part of it that stood out was not the part that was about socialism. And it's also, I think, very important to consider Teddy Roosevelt's role in all of this. Teddy Roosevelt has I would say, exaggerated reputation as a pro-labor president. He was certainly progressive, and he was very popular. He gets this reputation as a pro-labor president because of his response to the coal miners' strike of 1902, which I'll get into later. But it kind of leads to a consideration of him. The most pro-labor thing about him, to put it succinctly, is that he didn't immediately just want to send in the army and start shooting at strikers. And so to them, that was like, oh my God, this guy he's our guy. He doesn't want to shoot us right away. So, labor in Packingtown specifically. So first thing to understand is the butcher aristocracy, which is the term that they used at the time. This was the small group of high-skill butchers who were really true butchers who could do the most difficult knife work on the assembly, well, or rather disassembly line. And and they were overwhelmingly German and Irish and some native-born white Americans. And one of the things that was very different about the 1904 strike, which happened right before Upton Sinclair got there, was the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union began unionizing across lines of skill and across lines of ethnicity and race. And one of the things that they contended, because there were so many positions and it was a wide spectrum that was populated all along the spectrum from you don't need to know anything because you're sweeping up entrails off the floor to you are a full-fledged butcher, there was a point everywhere on the spectrum where you could get a job. And so one of the contentions was that if you can't really draw a line anywhere on that spectrum where skill stops and unskill starts. So the butcher aristocracy, which leading up to this period of labor history in Chicago, was very insular and had great solidarity within the high-skilled butchers and did a really good job of participating in strikes and maintaining discipline with the other butchers, or if the butchers decided to support another strike. But for a long time, they weren't really interested in unionizing with the guys who swept the floors. And the beef trust, which I got into a little ahead of time because I was excited to be critical of that insane situation. And then the local run-up to the labor situation in Chicago. The 1894 Pullman strike was led by Eugene Debs. A lot of the strikes in Chicago history, the big three strikes, the 1877, 1886, and 1894, all three of them had a lot of violence involved. The railroad strike of 1877 saw an event called the Battle of the Viaduct, which happened at Halsted and 16th. The cops just started blasting. The 1886 Haymarket Affair, where there was a peaceful gathering for most of the day, then later in the evening, the cops show up against the orders of the mayor at the time, who had personally gone to the rally to make sure that there were no shenanigans, saw that everything was fine, so he left and told the cops to go home. And so the cops showed up and began to clear the event, and this was very, very soon after the invention of dynamite. Somebody essentially just threw a stick of dynamite into the middle of all the police officers, and it was instant havoc. The police just started shooting. Some of them were shooting each other because they were lined up in ranks. It was really a complete disaster. So when the 1904 strike happens, there is a lot of, this is going to be a disaster. But it was well organized, it was disciplined, and it was relatively peaceful, and it was a complete failure. The Beef Trust began to, and this is a long-standing policy of their strategy. They specifically hire in ways to inflame racial and ethnic tensions. They kind of had three pools of labor. There's kind of three tiers that your labor's in. There's the butcher aristocracy. If you're German and Irish or native-born white, you can end up in the very high-skill positions. If you're a Norwegian or a Polish immigrant, you end up with the more low-skill jobs, and they will very tightly monitor whether you are allowed to get promoted or stay long enough or have important jobs. And then during strikes, the hiring of scabs was essentially reserved for African Americans and for what Upton Sinclair refers to as the least desirable immigrants, which would be like Greeks and Romanians and Slovaks and Sicilians. Generally, just kind of like southern and southeastern Europe. the pattern you may have noticed is the further you get away from England, the more racism you're going to experience. And it was because of all this tension and because of this grinding down of the low-skilled workers that, in the words of the Chicago Socialist, a socialist newspaper, no place in the country offers greater promise for the future of socialism than Packingtown. Now, Teddy Roosevelt and his relationship with labor, the 1902 coal miners' strike was kind of the perfect situation for a president to get involved in labor and kind of intervene on labor's behalf. The coal miners, coal is vitally important at this time, and winter is approaching, and it's going to become a national catastrophe if people can't get their coal on time. And so the coal miners begin a strike. The operators are completely obtuse, completely unhelpful. There are a lot of public gestures made by the coal miners that the mine operators don't respond to at all, and that leads public opinion to kind of gravitate towards the coal miners. Excuse me. So he invites the mine operators and the coal miners to the White House. The mine operators continue to just be so obstinate to the point that you wonder why they even showed up to the meeting. And eventually Teddy Roosevelt secretly draws up plans to have the Army take over the coal mines and operate them in a receivership. And he indirectly kind of sets up these plans to get to the operators. And that's when the mine operators are like, okay, we'll submit to, appoint an arbitration board and we'll agree to abide by whatever it says. And the arbitration board set a lot of, some wage increases and fewer work hours. So that earned Teddy Roosevelt, that's way better than anybody had done before. So that earned Teddy Roosevelt a very pro-labor place in the popular mind, but this was also very opportunistic. The public opinion of the president can't fix the situation and I can't heat my house was a big threat to him. So he was opportunistically pro-labor. He was often very irritated by labor leaders if they kind of threatened his authority as the president. Which again leads to that muckraker speech. The speech that he gave where he kind of indicted muckrakers and muckraking authors as people who are more interested in making everything seem as bad as possible, and called them the greatest threat to the country, which is fascinating. Despite the injustice of this indictment, the muckrakers were never the same after Roosevelt's speech. The progressive president with wide popular following had called reform journalism extremist, and any further exposures could be dismissed as mere muckraking. Reform journalists sensed immediately that they had received a possibly fatal blow. He was much more interested in foreign policy and on railroad reform and busting railroad trusts. So that's what he was focused on. But this opportunity came up, and the president was a good politician, and he couldn't turn it down. This is a quote from Upton Sinclair. He was very, very indifferent to the meat sanitation horrors that he portrayed and documented. He was very focused on them as a more general example of, like, look at how bad the meat packers are. And this postcard is from Great Britain. This had a worldwide impact. Winston Churchill, in his early political career, when he was just a minister of parliament, wrote a review for The Jungle. And he said it was a great book. It's exposed some horrible stuff. And the socialist ending was kind of shoehorned in. I'm not really critical of the socialism specifically, but as a feature of the book, it really is kind of, he really wants to make it clear the solution to the problems is becoming a socialist, and it's not like any kind of material things that the socialism teaches you. Once you're a socialist, you got it made, essentially. Now, like I said, he used sanitation as a sort of lens for the moral degradation. He was focused very broadly on things that he could portray as examples of moral degradation. And so he talks about the way that people are treated in the meat packing yards. He talks about the corruption in the city and in the packing yards. He talks about how if you upset your supervisor, all the supervisors at the different companies are going to work with each other, and they're going to put you on a blacklist, and you can't get hired anywhere. He talks a lot about the way women are treated and the way women are exploited in the packing yards. And he also does it in kind of a way where he says, like, isn't this terrible that this poor woman can't take her place in, like, managing the family? It's a very of its time kind of, like, look at what this is doing to women. Women, belong with taking care of the children, and this is, it was just a sort of extra criticism. So he does make what I think, for the time, is a great sort of exploration of the effects on women's health, which I thought was surprisingly, just good for the era. You wouldn't expect this guy to be all that feminist and, consider women's health as important as any of the other terrible things that were going on. So I will give him that, but excuse me. So the generalized disgust that he was trying to show was just another example of the overall degeneracy of the meat packers. This is Upton Sinclair. I really paid very little attention to the meat question while I was in Chicago. When I had once studied out the universal system of graft which prevails in the place, the meat graft seemed to me simply a natural and obvious part of it. I do not eat much meat myself, and my general attitude toward the matter was one of indifference. I was of the opinion, and am still of the opinion, that any man who takes into his stomach food which has been prepared under the direction of unscrupulous commercial pirates such as the Chicago Packers deserves all the poisoning he gets. I'm not worried about that. I'm just glad the beer didn't spill. And this is also the inverse of what was happening on the labor issue. There were already lots of attempts to pass meat sanitation laws. Between 1879 and 1906, 190 measures connected to pure food or drugs were introduced in Congress, and only 8 ever became law. There was also the background of the Spanish-American War. There was a major scandal of the embalmed beef scandal. Tinned beef, about I believe 300 or 400 tons of it was shipped out to soldiers fighting in the Spanish-American War. In that war, 280 soldiers were killed in battle. 2,630 were lost to other causes. Now, to be fair, which is not something I'm going to do for the meat companies very much in this talk. To be fair, most of that was from typhoid fever. And typhoid fever was brutal for everybody who was fighting in the war. But many of these illness deaths were caused by eating canned meat that was embalmed with either boric acid or salicylic acid. Mm-hmm. Mm. It's also for me that I'm not talking a lot about the disgusting meat stuff, but so there were already members of Congress who were repeatedly pressing and who also, in addition to Teddy Roosevelt, who were also prepared to take advantage of the excellent political situation that this book gave them. But even then, after the Supreme Court decision that kind of outlawed formal trusts, the beef trust itself did a really good job of cooperating. And it wasn't until 1917 that Woodrow Wilson kind of put into motion the end of the beef trust. So in 1917, 55% of the entire slaughtering market was tied up in the beef trust. Before, it was 55% of all the cattle in America were slaughtered in the Union stockyards. By 1917, 55% of the entire meat market. And so in 1970, because of Woodrow Wilson's actions, the meat market had become much more competitive. The top 4 companies slaughtered only 21% of all cattle in the country. But then in the 80s, the Reagan administration was much more friendly to large trust action and to more market power concentration. And by now, today, the top 4 companies in the meatpacking industry slaughter 85% of all the cattle in the country. It is not all as much in one location, obviously not in Chicago, but it's not all concentrated in one location, but it's concentrated among those participants. They also owned 91% of all the refrigerator cars in the country. So if you had any other kind of good that you had to ship in a refrigerator train car, you had to pay rent to the meatpacking companies. In 1918, 60,000 towns across the country had rail service, and 58,000 of those towns got all their meat shipped in from beef trust slaughterhouses. And finally, the Reynolds-Neal report, excuse me. Reynolds and Neal were the 2 people that Teddy Roosevelt sent to Chicago to inspect the stockyards. He wanted to appoint people he trusted to figure out if anything that Upton Sinclair was saying was true. And Teddy Roosevelt, on its face, didn't believe a thing Upton Sinclair said. He hated this guy personally, was furious about the book, and was kind of irritated that he had to pay attention to this. And Upton Sinclair had a lot of criticisms for Teddy Roosevelt with the way that he handled this. He was furious that 2 very well-known people, especially if you're a meat packer, were going to Chicago to take care of this. And he was upset that the meat packers knew that they were coming so they could clean everything up. But it's also very illuminating that things were so bad with even those things being true, these guys essentially found that everything Upton Sinclair said was true. And another thing that bothered Upton Sinclair was that they wouldn't be inspecting the working conditions. They would only be inspecting the meat conditions. And so Teddy Roosevelt said, okay, fine, I guess we'll look at how the people are treated and not just the food. And they found, this is another quote from the report, the various departments are under the direct control of superintendents who claim to use full authority in dealing with the employees and who seem to ignore all considerations except those of the account book. Under this system, proper care of the products and of the health and comfort of the employees is impossible, and the consumer suffers in consequence. I can save the most important part for last. Even the ordinary decencies of life are ignored. Now, immigration. In the 1990s, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which in 2001 became both Customs and Border Patrol and ICE, determined that of all meatpacking workers in Iowa and Nebraska, where the industry is concentrated, 1/4 of all workers were undocumented immigrants. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. They will work for less, and most importantly, they will be more reluctant to join a union. These meatpacking companies did then and still do send recruiters to refugee communities. They will send recruiters to homeless shelters, and they will send buses out to these places thousands of miles away in big cities to bring the labor back to where their stockyards are in more remote locations. And these are the same tactics that the armor company used. They deliberately made their hiring decisions in ways that would inflame racial and ethnic tensions. Now, like I said, Upton Sinclair was racist. like I said, Black Americans in the jungle were mostly portrayed as scabs and especially kind of immoral scabs. And this also reflected the attitudes of people at the time. During the strike of 1904, scabs and strikebreakers came from all walks of life, but overwhelmingly the scabs who received the most violence, and everybody did. There was a lot of violence within communities. If you were a Lithuanian scab, when you came home from work, you would get beat up by other Lithuanians. If you were a Norwegian scab, you would get beat up by Norwegians. If you were a black scab, you would be attacked by everybody. This is this may be where the term wrong side of the tracks comes from, because Bronzeville was on the other side of the railroad tracks. And that's where the African Americans lived. And they had to cross the railroad tracks to get to the Union Stockyards. So during the strike, if you were a black person in back of the yards, in the stockyards area, the immediate assumption is, you're a scab, what do you think you're doing here? So the African Americans got the worst of it. And the certain groups of immigrants also kind of became defined by their proximity to whiteness. So if you were, in the history of immigration in America, you've got the three main eras of immigration, which is from the founding to 1840, from 1840 to 1924, and from 1924 to now. In 1840 is when all of the Irish immigrants started showing up. And Irish, while people would admit that Irish people were white, but they would be unhappy about it. And so you had to be sure, I mean, especially if you have, Irish grandparents who are from Chicago, they'll tell you all about the Irish need not apply signs. The whiteness of the Irish people was kind of a formality. And it took a long time for them to build up that cultural and political power and be accepted as part of the amalgamation that is being American. And so from 1840 all the way to 1924, the character of immigration in the country changes very radically. It goes from near England to Northern Europe to Eastern Europe and then to Southern Europe. So when he says the lowest foreigners, Greeks, Romanians, Sicilians, and Slovaks, these people were not really considered white, and the lines of who is white shifted all over Europe throughout this entire period of history. Now, like I said, you've got your three classes of labor, three pools of labor that you pull from. You have your butcher aristocracy. You get your Germans and your Irish. These are the most desirable Americans, the most American people that worked in Chicago. And then a step below that, you have Swedes, Lithuanians, and Poles. They would take the low-skill jobs. And then you have essentially a reserve pool of labor that you only hire as a scab. And that was African Americans, Greeks, and Southeastern Europeans. Now, Philip Armour, like I said, specifically hired in ways that would inflame these tensions, and they would actually be they wouldn't hide it at all. They would be so unashamed of it that if reporters came and asked, like, oh, you seem to hire a lot of, everybody here is Norwegian, and the guy's like, yeah, this week we got Norwegians, and the next week the Slovaks are going to work here, and we keep rotating them because they don't get to know each other. They'll start joining unions. We make sure they stay hating each other. And this was all connected to the sort of like biological evolutionary language of the time. The way that they described it was essentially summed up in the concept of fitness for self-government. There was a concept that Woodrow Wilson particularly liked called Teutonic germ theory, which is that the founders of America were naturally letting the tendencies of their racial origins come out in their political philosophy. And this allowed them to write something so amazing as the American Constitution. And when you let in other people from other parts of Europe who are less white than Anglo-Saxons, then you need to be concerned about those groups' fitness for self-government, and whether, most importantly, the end conclusion of all these questions is whether they can really become American. Because even in the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, in his reviews, calls the United States the Great Republic. And so it was so important to Americans that the American identity was that we govern ourselves and we control our own destiny. So if you're not racially capable of doing that, then you can't become American. And these are the kinds of philosophical justifications that were floating around about immigration at the time. And so Upton Sinclair dedicated his book to the working men of America. And so in light of everything that's going on, I think it would be malpractice to not talk about any of it. And I've spoken my piece, and I just want to dedicate this talk to immigrants in America. Thank you.